Hey folks, hope you all are doing well. I'm Karan Bandal from Econosite, your weekly economic wrap from India and around the world. So let's get started with China. What's preventing China from catching up to the United States? Let's see where China sits right now. China has made an amazing progress in the last few decades to become the world's second largest economy at around $18 trillion, matching the United States on several key parameters like poverty eradication, life expectancy, human capital index, and many others. China's annual growth averaged around 10% in the 2000s and 7% in the 2010s. Then COVID hit. China, still under partial lockdown as part of their zero COVID policy in 2022, somehow managed to grow at a meager rate of 3% that year. Once zero COVID was scrapped in December 2022, a strong economic rebound was expected. That rebound is nowhere to be seen even as we enter the second half of 2023. China is on course to hit just 5% growth this year. Experts expect China's economy to slow to a 3% growth rate once the economy stabilizes post-rebound, which will feel like a recession when youth unemployment is already above 20%. China is entering an era of a much slower economic growth, raising a daunting prospect. It may never get rich. See this GDP per capita chart. From 1990 to 2022, China has comfortably crossed middle income average but sits quite a distance below the average GDP per capita of high income countries. And slowing growth for China going forward is particularly troubling because China risks repeating what happened to Japan. Japan's GDP per capita matched the average of high income countries back in 1990 when it began to slow down or stagnate. Look where Japan's GDP per capita is today. So why is China slowing? First, unlike in the United States, Germany, Japan, or the world on average, where consumption forms the main pillar of the economy, China scores poorly on this front, where consumption makes up only about 38% of China's GDP. Now on top of that, with an aging and shrinking population, this is going to get very challenging for China to turn around. Second, China's economy is overly reliant on property and investment. You can see GFCF or asset creation makes up 42% of China's GDP, way more than the world on average. Now that China's property sector has hit a hard landing, this engine of growth also appears to be compromised. And the third factor is China's debt. Since 2010, debt has exploded to 3 times the GDP in 2022. Infrastructure or GFCF investments made by China in recent years clearly has generated more debt than growth. With debt load this high, China's ability to kickstart the growth through stimulus is also hamstrung. We'll see how China tackles these multifaceted challenges to its growth prospects. Moving on to India's plan to boost research. India's economy is in the world's top 10 by gross domestic product, 5th largest to be specific. However, the nation's spending on research and development or R&D is low. India spent less than 0.7% of its GDP in 2018 on R&D. For comparison, look at the two larger economies than India. In the same year, China's research expenditure made up more than 2% of its GDP, while United States spent an even higher amount at 3%. On the other side, several countries in smaller economies than India, such as Brazil and Malaysia, also spend proportionally more on R&D. It appears that the Indian authorities have identified this problem area. India has roughly 40,000 higher education institutions, most run by the states. More than 95% of higher education students go to these state-funded universities and colleges. These institutions have a limited capacity for research. Less than 1% of all higher education institutions in India conduct research. Now there is a research funding body that exists in India. It is called SERB, that is Science and Engineering Research Board. This funding body is part of the Department of Science and Technology. Of all the research funds that SERB provide, only 11% go to state universities. About 65% go to Indian Institutes of Technology or IITs, and these IITs are owned by the federal government. There are only 23 IITs in India. you can see the disparity in research funding and just the overall precarious state of research in India. This is where the National Research Foundation or NRF comes into the picture. India is planning to set up NRF as a national agency. The NRF was proposed in the 2020 National Education Policy as a way to build research capacity across India's academic centers, rather than supporting the few that are already carrying out research. The NRF is set to subsume the ACRB. NRF will have a budget of roughly $6 billion over 5 years. Some 70% of this fund is intended to come from investors in the private sector, and the remaining portion will be covered by the government. If NRF manages to meet its goal of gathering more than $4 billion from the industry, India's R&D expenditure will see a quantum jump. Finally, foreign direct investment in the US is booming, boosted by incentives offered by the US Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. The United States benefited from a significant increase in foreign investment into its manufacturing sector in 2022. Official data showed that foreign direct investment in greenfield projects, including both the establishment and expansion of US businesses, hit $5.3 billion in just the American manufacturing sector. This is more than double the pre-pandemic levels. Within manufacturing, the computer and electronic products sectors took the largest share of greenfield investments, totaling $1.8 billion. Also, across all sectors, not just manufacturing, the number of $1 billion plus greenfield projects jumped last year to 16 from only 5 the previous year. In summary, China's growth is slowing due to some deep-rooted structural problems. Their declining demographics further add to China's growth concerns. United States, on the other hand, is looking at a revival in American manufacturing. In 2022, manufacturing construction in the US boomed. Foreign direct investment more than doubled, and almost 1 million manufacturing jobs were created in the last 2 years. While India tries to address one of her weaknesses, capacity for research, by setting up a new national agency, the National Research Foundation, with a $6 billion worth of firepower to begin with. I hope you found this week's wrap interesting. I'll speak with you again next week. Until then, take care.